Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monthly Sales, and thank you for coming out on this warm Saturday morning. My name is Eric Currio. I'm of the St. Pius V Lay Dominicans. We practice the Dominican spirituality, living in the world, but not of the world. If you're interested in finding out more about us, feel free to speak to one of the members here. We have some business cards and information here at the sign-in sheet. Check out our website at www.piusv.org. And for this morning's talk, I'd like to welcome Father Carlos to talk on the Christian response to radical Islam. Father Carlos is our religious assistant based at the Dominican House of Studies. So please welcome Father Carlos.
You really think this is coffee? Thank you. In 1922, as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk revived Turkish nationalism, and he abolished the Sultanate and proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. One of the consequences of that was that since the late 14th century, since the invasion of the Mongols, the Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph, or the successor of the Prophet. And so, in abolishing the Sultanate, he pretty much abolished almost 700, since, I'm doing the math right now, 1,300 years of history of the Caliphate. Now, they tried to maintain the Caliphate as a separate entity from the Sultan, but that didn't work, and in 1924, the Caliphate itself was abolished by Kemal Atatürk. Fast forward 90 years later, 2014, in the midst of all the fighting in the Middle East, the leader of Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, proclaims himself the Caliph. This certainly was a momentous time. And the intervening period between the abolition of the Caliphate and al-Baghdadi proclaiming himself the Caliph, a lot has happened in the Middle East and a lot has happened in Islam. I'm here to talk about what the Christian response is to radical Islam. And this is a tough question to answer. In many ways, I'm not too sure if there actually is an answer. What is the Christian response, and what shape would that response take? I think that's something I hope to explore together with you all. But another thing that is difficult to answer, what is radical Islam? What is Islam itself? And I think we have to answer this question before we can answer the question as to what is our response as Christians to what is called radical Islam, Islamism, Islamic fundamentalism, however you want to label it. And it's going to be difficult because those are Western labels. It's certainly not the way Muslims see themselves. It's a vision that it's a category that we have kind of imposed, as we have kind of imposed the present-day borders of the Middle East with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I actually first got interested in Islam back in high school. I was exposed. I had few classmates, more in college than in high school, who were from, at least from North Africa, maybe not from the Middle East. And the Lebanese students I knew in college themselves were all Christians. I think only one of them was a Muslim. But I remember in high school reading a book, a history book. I had gotten interested in Spain, the history of Spain, and particularly the Reconquest and the whole cultural exchange between Christianity and Islam that happened in Spain in the Middle Ages. And this was part of a series of history books in French that had the title of Daily Life in ... And this particular book was The Daily Life in Al-Andalus, which was the name for Islamic Spain. And it kind of went through the history of the Muslims, of the Arabs in Spain, roughly till about the 13th century when everything began to collapse. And there was a story in there that really caught my eye, and it was discussing, it was discussing what was going on with Christians in the Muslim territories in Spain, and it was a story that was very early, and it comes from the martyrology of the Christians in Muslim Spain, and it's very early on in the occupation in Cordoba during the Caliphate years, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba. These two Muslims asked this one Christian what they think of the Prophet Muhammad. And this Christian says, well, he referred to the part in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus, there's actually two passages, and I can't remember the exact citation. I know I looked it up, and I should have written it down, but I didn't. Where Jesus warns his disciples about the false prophets and how they will lead them astray. And the Christian added, this is what we think of Muhammad. He's a false prophet. Of course, the two Muslims were incensed, and they immediately seized him and brought him before the Qadi, the judge, the religious judge. And without failure, he was accused and convicted of blasphemy and executed forthwith. And that story has stayed with me for a long time and kind of resurrected now because, well, partly because we have the Islamic State who are executing Christians left and right just because they are Christians. As you know, you probably know already, the Patriarch of Alexandria, his beatitude Herodotus I, has declared that the 21 Coptic Christians that were executed in Libya are martyrs for the faith. But for me, it kind of symbolizes the clash of civilizations, or the clash of cultures, the clash of religions, that has, in many ways, typified relations between Christianity and Islam. And one of the things I'd like to talk about is that we really have to figure out, where does this clash come from? Where do these differences come from? If we don't know the differences, how are we to work to to live together, to respond to what is going on in the Middle East, to respond to Muslims that are living amongst us and who want to live amongst us, who want to live in peace and harmony with us. So, one of the things, so there are basically two things I'm going to do in this talk. First, I just want to make, just take some concepts in Islam and kind of define them, kind of talk about them and what they are. And the second, as I'm talking about these concepts, is to point out the differences between Islam and Christianity that make it very hard for us to dialogue together. And then I would like to finish in concluding on what would a Christian response actually be. My basic source for this is, it comes from basically two books by Bernard Lewis, and I highly recommend him. He's probably the eminent scholar on Islam in the English-speaking world. Two books that he wrote. First one is What Went Wrong? And it's basically about the encounter between Christianity, between the Western world, not to say the Christian world, but the Western world and the Islamic world, and the consequences of that, in particular in the 19th and 20th century, at the outset of the imperial age, so to speak, beginning with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, 1799, somewhere around there. And he wrote that before 9/11, and he published a second edition somewhere in around 2003, 2005, with an afterword that discusses the events of 9/11. And a second book that he wrote after that called Islam in Crisis, which is probably much more of an explanation of Islam and how we got to the point where we have all these radical Islamic groups and the difficulties in the whole idea of jihad and Islamic terrorism. And that was published in 2003, I believe, 2003. And of course, you're probably also aware, recently, the March issue of Atlantic magazine, there's a very long article by Graham Wood on precisely on Islamic State. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I was tipped onto this by Peggy Noonan's column in the Wall Street Journal last week, where she kind of gave a summary. But if you actually read the whole article, it is quite fascinating. One of the premises that, the basic idea that Bernard Lewis is moving from is that the encounter between the West and Islam, or basically the encounter of Islam and modernity, proved to be somewhat, I wouldn't say disastrous, but certainly a shattering experience, because up until that point, as far as civilizations were concerned, Islam was probably the more advanced civilization. And then beginning in this period, the West had caught up and eventually surpassed Islam as a civilization, and ended up, in terms of Islamic eyes, occupying the land of Islam, and that is epitomized by the abolition of the caliphate by Ataturk, and Turkey modernizing itself along Western lines. So, well, so what is Islam? Well, Islam is certainly, as a religion, a system of belief and worship. It is a system that regulates the daily life of believers in terms of their relationship to God and their relationship to each other, just like any other religion. But there is something more to it than just that, because Islam encompasses a whole religious, social, and political vision of society. So that Islam is more than just a religion, it is a whole civilization that accompanies that system of belief. A civilization that rose with that system of belief, that incorporated elements from other civilizations, most notably a lot of the Greek learning they absorbed from the Byzantine Empire and other things. And to be sure, there are certainly quite a few resemblances or coinciding points between Christianity and Islam. First of all, monotheism. The belief that there is one God. The other important correlation between Christianity and Islam is its universalism. Both make claims to a kind of universal hold over the human person and over human society, and a specific eschatological belief that one day everything will be under Christ. So also the Muslims believe that one day everything will be under Islam. So there's kind of a eschatological element to it, and there's also a triumphalistic element to it. So those things are very closely aligned. And of course, when you have two systems that claim a universal, that have a universal claim to the truth, there's going to be clashes. They're going to be competing with each other. But there are huge differences between Islam and Christianity, and these aren't subtle differences. First of all, in Islam, the idea of the incarnation is just not only not there, it's an impossibility. God is God. To say that he is incarnate in man is blasphemy. To say that God can have a son is blasphemy. So right there is a huge difference between Islam and Christianity. And there is another very important difference. As you recall, in Matthew's Gospel, and this is something that's been touted out quite recently today in our country, particularly in church-state relations, when Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees and the scribes about paying the tax to Caesar. And he holds up the coin, whose image is on this coin, Caesar's. And he says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." Now this, for Christianity, particularly for modern Christianity, is the basis of our whole idea of the separation of church and state. That the realms of governance of human society and the realms of the human soul are, quote unquote, separate. That the church as an institution is its own separate entity from the state. And if we look at the history of Christianity, the whole history, a lot of the history of Christianity is this clash between church and state, and how to work out the relationship between church and state. And for the first few hundred years of Christianity, it was a persecuted religion. It was state policy to search out Christians and have them either renounce their faith or have them executed. Until, famously, in 315, Constantine becomes the emperor. And so Caesar and the church are united. Now that had disastrous consequences, because that had difficult consequences for the rest of Christian history. Is all you have to do is look at the medieval controversy about the investitures between the Pope and the Emperor in the 10th and 11th century. Particularly between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. And the French Revolution and everything that happened in the 19th century, Syllabus of Errors, and of course the Second Vatican Council on particularly, the Declaration on freedom of religion. That doesn't exist in Islam. And the best way I can contrast this is in Christianity, the founder of Christianity, Jesus Christ, was executed as a criminal by the state. And the religion had to live underground for 200 years. In Islam, the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, became a political leader. In other words, the founder of Islam became Constantine, became Caesar. And he governed over a people and a society with all its consequences. So that whole idea of separation of church and state, to the extent you can characterize the idea of a church in Islam, does not exist. That everything is under, everything, even human law, is under the aegis of divine will of God. This is why the abolition of the caliphate and its resurrection by Islamic State is so important, at least symbolically. Because that means that there is a ruler over the land of Islam. So there is no separation between the regnum, secular politics, and the sacerdotium, the worship, devotion of the faithful. As Ayatollah Khomeini put it once, Islam is politics or it is nothing. So there is this whole polity that has integrated this belief system. And it has created what is the Muslim identity. A society that lives under divine law, that submits itself to the divine will. And this includes the fact that non-Muslims must submit themselves to Muslim rule. So that's kind of like the beginning. This is kind of like the worldview that they have. And that's what we have to work with. I just want to go through several concepts or several things in Islam that will kind of flesh out a little bit more of this vision of Islam, of the world of Islam, and its confrontation with the world of non-Islam. The first concept is the concept of Tawhid, which is unicity. And it is a specific reference to divine unicity. While that word Tawhid does not appear in the Quran, the concept of unicity is implicit in Islam, particularly with their proclamation of faith. There is no God but God. And God is one. There is no such thing as a Trinity. That everything is one in God. And that has consequences for society and for the polity. Society in Islam is one. What is very paramount in Islam is the concept of society and the concept of justice. That a true society and a true justice can only live under the sovereignty of divine will. And justice within that society is paramount. So you have all these social, what we would call social welfare programs in today's lingo, in today's jargon, built into Islam. Things of charity, which is very important, helping the poor, setting up financially, setting up healthcare, setting up education. All these things are integral to the belief system in Islam in a way that is different from what we think of in Christianity with the church's social teaching. It also means that there is no speculation about God. We don't speculate about God, His nature, who He is. The whole idea of theology as it is practiced in the West does not exist in Islam. And since that is the case, it demands obedience. Obedience to God's will. Obedience to the Prophet, or to the sayings of the Prophet. It is basically a very fideistic system. Rationality has very little to do with anything in Islam, certainly theological. So it really is a crass fideism. Next is Quran. What is the Quran? Well, it is basically God's revelation to Muhammad, the Prophet, as written down and recorded. It is literally the Word of God in a way that is different from what we understand as the concept of the Word of God. We have, if you look at the Gospel, the prologue to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the the Word was God, and then a few verses down, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is different. This is God dictating his revelation to Muhammad, who wrote it down faithfully. The concept of revelation in Islam is basically a direct command from God to the human person. Whereas in Christianity, and to a certain extent in Judaism, we recognize the human element in revelation. That God reveals himself to man using human words, human signs, and using a human author who still has free will, intellect and free will. So it's God using the language of men in order to reveal himself to man through the agency of other men. Very different concept of revelation. It's a very different attitude towards prophecy, towards the Word of God. So that if there is even the idea of free will becomes very difficult in Islam because of the concept, how they understand revelation. Again, the implication is that we must submit to God's will, regardless. The second very important difference, and this is what makes dialogue with Islam, and particularly in today's world, very difficult, is the concept of clergy. Now, there is a word in Arabic called ulama, which we kind of loosely translate as clergy. And really what it means is learned men. And we talk about Islamic clerics and the clergy and this and that, but it's a very, very different kettle of fish. Particularly if you take it from a Catholic perspective, but at least in a general Christian sense, there is an ordained clergy. There is some sort of hierarchy, if you want to use that word. Probably applies less to the Protestant denominations than to Catholic and Orthodox. That there is a sacerdocium, that these are men appointed, called by God as intermediaries, in some sense, between the community and God, that officiate over worship, that give authoritative interpretations. Now, there is some of that in Islam, imams, sheikhs, but it's much more loose. And particularly if you look at it from a Catholic point of view, where we have the Holy Father, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who is the successor of Peter, the Vicar of Christ, who is the ultimate authority in an interpretation of matters of faith and morals. That does not exist in Islam. The men who function as clerics are men who have done many years of study, usually under a master, and have become experts in the Quran. They have become experts in the tradition. They have become experts in Sharia, in the Sharia law. But they aren't unified. And it's been complicated today because before, it would only be certain men who had spent a long time studying the Quran who are certainly already of a certain age, that would be looked up to or called upon as mufti or qadi or imams. Today, you know, there are lots of young men out there who proclaim to be experts in Islam. They haven't had the course of studies. They haven't had this. They haven't had the rigor of all those years studying under a master. So there's nothing that kind of regulates what this belief system is. There's no intermediary. And so then the problem becomes, who speaks for Islam? Who is a proper spokesperson? Well, we can look to Catholics and say, well, the Pope speaks for Catholics. He speaks about Catholic doctrine. The Anglican Communion can look to the Archbishop of Canterbury and say that he at least represents some sort of pole of unity for the Anglican Communion, and that he has some sort of authority, moral, spiritual, however you want to characterize it, over the Anglican Communion. Mormons, you can look at the Council of 12 and the prophet at the head of the Mormon Church, and they represent and can speak authoritatively of about what Mormons believe. You can look to the Patriarch of Moscow. This is what Russian Orthodox believe. Or the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, in Istanbul. There's not a single person, not a single authority in Islam that you could point to and say that he speaks authoritatively for Islam, for all of Islam. And so the next concept is probably the most charged and difficult concept, is the concept of jihad. Now, this word has been bandied about lately rather loosely, particularly by conservative groups and the media. But I think it's been bandied about with not really understanding what it is, what it's about. And Muslims across the world are trying to correct this idea of jihad. Jihad literally means struggle. That's it. Struggle. The thing is that this word appears in the Quran many times, but in different contexts. On the one hand, particularly in what we know to be some of the earlier verses in the Quran, when Muhammad was still in Mecca and being persecuted by his co-citizens of Mecca. The emphasis in jihad was an interior struggle, a personal struggle with evil. In the later verses that we have in the Quran, those that were written down when Muhammad had to flee Mecca because of his persecution and establish himself in Medina and was locked in an armed struggle with Mecca. Jihad has a much more militaristic overtone that is talking about armed struggle to conquer the forces of evil. So these two senses exist already at the heart of Islam in the Quran. And it is, in some ways, it is kind of like this military struggle, this armed combat that almost takes over in the concept of jihad because, again, because of the historical circumstances of how Islam arises. That ends up being the ruler of the Arabian Peninsula. He ends up with political power. And upon his death, his successors have taken upon themselves to expand that power. So the concept of jihad, although having this dual meaning of interior spiritual battle with evil and then an overt armed struggle with evil out there in the world, it develops in a period of expansion of Islam, that it was expansion through conquest. And the superiority of Islam is borne out in the fact that the opposing armies are defeated. The Sassanid Empire collapsed, defeated. The Byzantine Empire almost collapses, defeated. They get to the doors of Constantinople, but they're not able to take over Constantinople. But still, the Byzantine Empire becomes a shadow of its former self. It goes into Egypt, runs across northern Africa. They come into Spain, defeat the Visigoths, and they push into the heart of Europe until the Franks under Charles Martel defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers in 725. So often our idea of jihad is that of conquest, of holy war, equivalent to our crusades. Although we must nuance what we mean on our Christian side, what the crusade actually was, which is not how it's actually being depicted in today's media. So within Islam, there is this dual tension between the interior piety, the interior struggle, the interior struggle against evil, the personal submission to God and believing in God as a merciful God, and this very on the one hand, and on the other hand, this very robust, self-confident vision of God that goes out into the world and conquers evil militarily. And this dichotomy, this radical dichotomy between good and evil in the world, and the dichotomy between Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, the land that is submitted to the will of God, and Dar al-Harb, the world outside of Dar al-Islam, which is the land of war, the land of chaos. And that one day all that will be subsumed into the land of Islam. And Islam has kind of teetered between those two poles throughout its history, and we see that being played out today. We see that being played out today between the various factions within Islam, those who want to call Islam a religion of peace, and yet you have these radical Islamists that are interpreting the Quran in a very radical and almost an originalist, literalist way, saying that we have to destroy the infidel. And that it's basically a struggle between quietism and authoritarian quietism and a radical activist form of Islam. These two traditions exist side by side. And hence one of the difficulties, or probably the greatest difficulty Islam in an interreligious dialogue. That's not, to say, that's not to say that, that is specifically to say this radicalism that we're experiencing in the world of Islam is non-Islam. It is. It's an interpretation of Islam. It's going back to the original text, interpreting it in a very literal way, in a very radical way. It's been one way to characterize it is that radical Islam today has more in common with the Jacobins of the French Revolution and the Bolsheviks than anything else. In any case, their armed struggle, and this is particularly the case for, we'll say, the Muslim Brotherhood, and more importantly, Al-Qaeda and the Iranian Revolution. That is, it's a Jacobin expression of Islam.